71 degrees below zero. At this temperature, steel becomes brittle like glass, and your breath freezes before it hits the ground. But for 90-year-old Clara, the biting cold was the least of her worries. She was alone in the Siberian wilderness, standing between her beloved flock and a starving army of 2,000 wolves. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of the longest night. The thermometer nailed to the log wall of the cabin didn't just drop. It died. The mercury had huddled at the very bottom of the bulb for 3 days straight, burying itself past the mark that read 60 degrees Celsius. Outside, the air itself seemed to have solidified. This was the Oymyakon Valley in Yakutia, the pole of cold, a place where the landscape didn't just kill the careless, it erased them. Clara sat by her cast-iron stove, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of boiling tea that was already cooling rapidly in the ambient draft. She was 90 years old. Her skin was a map of deep fissures, weathered by nearly a century of Siberian wind. But her eyes, pale blue and sharp, were as clear as the ice on the Indigirka River. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her son, David, who lived in the city of Yakutsk some 20 hours away by ice road, had begged her to leave last summer. He had sent letters, then a satellite phone which she rarely turned on, pleading with her to move to the assisted living facility in the city. "This winter will be different, Mother," David had warned during his last visit, his voice strained. "The meteorologists are predicting a black freeze. The cycles are shifting. Even the reindeer herders are moving south." "My sheep do not move south," Clara had replied, her voice sounding like crunching gravel. "And neither do I. Arthur built this cabin. I will not let the snow bury it while I still breathe." Arthur. Her husband had been gone for 10 years now, buried under a cairn of heavy stones on the ridge behind the sheep pen. Now, it was just Clara, her bolt-action rifle, a relic from the Great War, and her flock of 30 Yakutian snow sheep. They were hardy beasts, evolved to survive the apocalypse. But they were not invincible. The cabin groaned. The timber logs, contracting in the extreme temperature, cracked with sounds like pistol shots. Clara stood up, her joints popping in sympathy with the wood. She pulled on her gear. This was a ritual that took 20 minutes. First, the thermal layers, then the wool trousers, the reindeer hide boots, lined with fur, the parka that Arthur had sewn decades ago, heavy and smelling of wood smoke and lanolin, finally, the face mask and goggles. At 71 degrees Celsius, exposed skin freezes in seconds. The fluid in your eyes can turn to slush if you stare into the wind too long. She grabbed the rifle from its rack by the door. It was an old Mosin Nagant, the wood stock scratched and worn smooth by decades of handling. She checked the action. The oil she used was a special mixture Arthur had taught her to make synthetic motor oil cut with kerosene so it wouldn't gum up in the freeze. She pushed the heavy wooden door open. The cold hit her, not as a temperature, but as a physical blow. A solid wall of pressure that squeezed the air from her lungs. The world was blue and grey. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving the land in a perpetual, freezing twilight. The silence was absolute. In most places, silence is the absence of noise. In Yakutia, silence is a heavy, pressing weight. There were no birds, no wind, no rustling branches. Everything was paralyzed by the frost. Clara crunched through the snow toward the pen. The sheep were huddled in the center of the enclosure, a tight knot of wool and steam. They were agitated. Usually, when Clara approached, the ram, a massive beast she called Baron, would come to the fence, expecting salt or hay. Today, Baron was facing the other direction, toward the tree line of the tiger. His head was lowered, his horns ready. Clara stopped. She narrowed her eyes behind her goggles. The tree line was about 200 meters away. The spruce trees were ghosts, draped in heavy shrouds of snow. But between the trunks, something was wrong. The shadows were moving. Shadows don't move in the white silence. Clara raised her gloved hand to shield her goggles from the glare of the rising moon. She squinted. There. A pair of eyes reflected the moonlight. Then 2 more. Then 10. Then, the tree line seemed to ignite. It wasn't just a pack. A normal wolf pack in this region might have 6, maybe 12 members. If it was a bad year, maybe 20. This was a sea of eyes. They stretched from the frozen creek bed on the left all the way to the ridge on the right. They were motionless, silent. watching. Holy Mother, Clara whispered, her voice lost in the scarf wrapped around her face. It was the migration David had read about in the papers, the one the old radio broadcasts had hinted at before the signal died last week, the black tide. A convergence of superpacks from the northern tundra, driven south by a collapse in the caribou population. They weren't just hunting, they were scouring the earth. She did the math instantly. 30 sheep, one 90-year-old woman, and out there, waiting in the tree line, were not dozens, but hundreds, perhaps thousands of starving predators. Clara gripped the rifle tighter. She didn't retreat. She didn't run. She calmly unslung the rifle, racked the bolt, and fired a single warning shot into the air. Crack. The sound was deafening in the frozen air. The echo slapped against the mountains. Usually, a gunshot sends wolves scattering. The eyes in the tree line didn't blink. They didn't flinch. They just watched. The first twist of the knife. They weren't afraid of her. They knew the temperature. They knew she was old, and they knew she was alone. The echo of the gunshot died away, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the tundra. Clara stood there for a full minute, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wolves remained still. It was a standoff. A silent negotiation between the apex predator of the wild and the stubborn matriarch of the homestead. Then, a sound broke the stillness. It wasn't a howl. It was a low, rhythmic chuffing sound. Ha huff, ha huff. From the center of the tree line, a shape emerged. It was massive, significantly larger than the others. Its fur was not the usual grey-white of the timber wolves, but a deep, matted charcoal black. It limped slightly on its front left leg, a scar of an old battle. This was the alpha of alphas. The locals had a name for such beasts, whispered in the village taverns of Tomtor. The Kolat. The dead one. The black wolf took 3 steps into the clearing. He looked at the sheep pen, then lifted his head and looked directly at Clara. He didn't snarl. He simply assessed her. Then, he turned his head and let out a short, sharp bark. Immediately, the sea of eyes vanished. The wolves melted back into the shadows of the forest. Clara didn't let out her breath. She knew wolves. If they ran, it was instinct. If they retreated calmly, it was a tactic. They weren't leaving. They were waiting for the temperature to drop further. They were waiting for the dead of night. The hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., when the cold was most lethal and the human will was weakest. She backed away slowly, keeping the rifle raised, until she hit the door of her cabin. She slipped inside and slammed the heavy bolt shut. Her hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from adrenaline. She stripped off her goggles and went straight to the radio on the corner table. It was an old HF transceiver, a lifeline to the outside world. Mayday, mayday. Static. Just the white noise of the ionosphere. This is Clara. I have a situation. Hostiles. Massive count. Over. She adjusted the squelch. Nothing but the crackle of the aurora borealis interfering with the signal. The solar panels hadn't charged effectively for a week due to the heavy overcast snow clouds, and the extreme cold had drained the chemical efficiency of the lead-acid batteries. She had maybe an hour of radio time left, or enough power to run the perimeter lights for one night. Not both. She looked at the window. The frost was creeping up the glass, thick and opaque. If she used the radio to call for help, she would have to drain the batteries to boost the signal through the interference. But if she did that, the floodlights around the sheep pen would die. The lights were the only thing keeping the wolves from rushing the fence en masse. The wolves of Yakutia feared artificial light. It was unnatural, blinding. The choice was brutal. Call for help that might not come for days, or keep the lights on to survive the night. She looked at the photo of Arthur on the mantel. "Protect the flock, Clara," he would have said. "The flock is life." She switched off the radio. The light stayed. Clara spent the next hour preparing for war. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a survivor. She went to the root cellar, a trapdoor in the floor. The cold down there was less severe. She pulled up a heavy wooden crate marked with faded Russian letters. Inside were flares. Old, magnesium road flares Arthur had bartered from a military truck driver in the 90s. She didn't know if they would still strike, but they were her artillery. She also found a jar of bear fat and a bag of crushed glass, an old trapper's trick. She began to mix them. It was cruel, but survival is not about fairness. If they breached the cabin, she would need to slow them down. At 11 p.m., the first probe came. It started with the sound of wood splintering. Clara rushed to the small window facing the pen. 3 wolves had dashed from the tree line. They weren't attacking the sheep directly. They were attacking the infrastructure. One was gnawing at the wooden post of the fence. The other 2 were digging frantically at the frozen earth beneath the wire. "Smart bastards," Clara hissed. She cracked the window open just an inch enough to slide the barrel of the Mosin Nagant through. The cold air rushed in like a pressurized jet, instantly frosting her eyebrows. She aimed. Not at the wolves, but at the ground, right in front of them. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition on single targets when there were 2,000 waiting. She needed to scare them. Boom! The bullet struck the permafrost, sending a spray of ice shards into the snout of the digging wolf. It yelped and scrambled back. The others followed, but as they ran back to the darkness, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Beyond the circle of the floodlights, the darkness was teeming. The eyes were back, and they were closer. They had encircled the entire cabin. And then, the power flickered. The light bulb above her head buzzed and dimmed, then surged back to brightness. If the lights went out, the 2,000 would descend. Clara grabbed her coat. She had to go outside. She had to start the backup diesel generator. The generator shed was only 10 meters from the cabin door. In summer, a 5-second walk. Tonight, it was a gauntlet. She checked the rifle. 5 rounds in the magazine. She put a handful of loose cartridges in her pocket. She lit one of the magnesium flares, holding it in her left hand like a torch. The rifle in her right. She kicked the door open. The flare hissed, sputtering red sparks, casting long, dancing shadows against the snow. "Back!" she screamed into the night, her voice cracking. "Get back!" She stepped off the porch. Immediately, a grey blur launched itself from the side of the cabin. It wasn't from the tree line. A scout had been hiding under her own porch. The wolf hit her shoulder, heavy as a sack of cement. Clara went down hard into the snow, the flare flying from her hand and skittering away, hissing in a snowbank. The wolf was on top of her, jaws snapping inches from her face. She could smell its breath, rotten meat and old blood. Its teeth snagged the thick wool of her collar. Clara didn't panic. She didn't try to push the beast off. She was 90. She didn't have the strength. She twisted her body, jamming the barrel of the rifle upward into the soft fur of the wolf's belly. She pulled the trigger. The recoil drove the stock into the snow, but the wolf went limp instantly, a heavy, dead weight crushing her chest. She shoved the carcass aside, gasping for air that felt like swallowing knives. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the rifle. She looked up. The gunshot hadn't scared them this time. At the edge of the light, the black wolf, the Kolat, stepped into the open. He threw his head back and howled, a long, mournful sound that wasn't a call to hunt. It was a command to attack. From every direction, the snow began to churn. The siege had begun, and the generator was still 10 meters away. The snow around Clara erupted. It wasn't a chaotic scramble. It was a wave. The wolves closest to the light rushed her, a dozen grey streaks moving faster than thought. Clara didn't try to run back to the cabin. She was 90. She couldn't outrun a wolf in deep snow. She could only change the battlefield. She racked the bolt of the Mosin Nagant, firing from the hip. Boom, click-clack, boom. 2 shadows dropped, skidding into the drifts, staining the pristine white with sudden, violent red. But there were too many. She reached the generator shed, her lungs burning as if she'd swallowed acid. She slammed the thin plywood door behind her and threw the heavy iron latch. A second later, a heavy body slammed into the wood, shaking the entire structure. Claws raked against the timber, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, magnified 1,000 times. Inside, it was pitch black, save for the dying red sputter of the flare she had dropped outside. The beam cut through the freezing darkness and landed on the diesel generator. She hit the starter. Chug. Chug. Click. She hit it again. Chug. Click. "Damn you," she rasped. The diesel had gelled. Even with the additives, the temperature inside the uninsulated shed had dropped too low. The fuel lines were clogged with wax. There would be no power, no floodlights. Outside, The darkness was absolute. And in that darkness, the screams began. It wasn't a human scream. It was the bleating of the snow sheep. Clara froze. She pressed her eye to a knothole in the shed wall. The floodlights had died completely now, leaving only the moonlight. But it was enough to see the horror. The wolves had breached the pen. They were climbing over each other, using the frozen carcasses of the first wave as a ramp to vault the fence. Baron, the massive ram, was fighting. He was a whirl of horns and hoofs, smashing a wolf against the fence post, trampling another into the ice. But the pack was swarming him. They were latching onto his legs, dragging him down by sheer weight. "No," Clara whispered. Tears froze instantly on her cheeks. Arthur had loved those sheep. They were the only living things that remembered him. They were her family. She looked at the useless generator. Then she looked at the jerrycans of diesel stacked in the corner. She made a choice that only someone who has lived on the edge of the world can make. She couldn't fix the lights, but she could make light. She grabbed a jerrycan. She unscrewed the cap and splashed the thick, gelled fuel all over the wooden walls of the shed. She soaked the generator, the floor, the workbench. She kicked the door open. 3 wolves were waiting right there. They snarled, ready to spring. Clara didn't shoot. She lit a match, shielded it with her hand for a split second, and tossed it behind her into the shed. Whoosh! The fumes ignited first, followed by the gelled fuel. The shed, dry as bone from years of frost, turned into a blast furnace. The explosion of heat and light sent the 3 wolves scrambling back, blinded and terrified. Fire is the one thing the wild fears more than hunger. Clara stumbled away from the inferno, the heat searing her back even through the parka. The shed became a 20-foot torch, a beacon of orange fury against the purple night sky. The sudden, violent light flooded the yard. "Get away from them!" Clara screamed, her voice amplified by the rage of a mother protecting her young. She raised the rifle. The firelight gave her clear targets now. She didn't fire at random. She fired at the wolves attacking Baron. Crack, crack, crack. Her aim was true. A lifetime of hunting to survive had steadied her hands. 3 wolves dropped off the ram. Baron, realizing the tide had turned, lowered his head and charged the remaining attackers, tossing one clean over the fence with a sickening crunch of ribs. The pack in the pen broke. The fire, the noise, and the sudden resistance were too much. They vaulted back out, regrouping in the shadows. But Clara knew this wasn't victory. It was a pause. She stood between her burning shed and her cabin, the rifle hot in her hands. The fire would burn for maybe 20 minutes. After that, the shed would be ash. The darkness would return, and the Kolat was still out there. She looked toward the tree line. The black wolf was watching. He hadn't moved. He was studying the fire, calculating how long it would last. Clara retreated to her cabin porch. She was exhausted. Her heart was fluttering in her chest, arrhythmia, the doctor had called it. "You need rest, Clara." She checked her pockets. 2 rounds left. She patted her coat and felt something hard and cylindrical. The last flare. The shed roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The light began to fade. From the darkness, the rhythmic ha-huff breathing returned. The Kolat stepped into the circle of dying light. This time, he didn't bark. He just started running, straight at her. The Kolat didn't run like a dog. He moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. He covered the 50 meters between the trees and the porch in seconds. Behind him, the rest of the pack surged forward, a tidal wave of fur and teeth. Sensing the final kill, Clara didn't have time to aim the rifle. The bolt action was too slow for a charging target at this range. She threw the rifle down. She grabbed the heavy handle of the cabin door and threw herself inside, slamming it shut just as a heavy thud shook the timber. Claws tore at the wood. The Kolat was scratching at the door, testing the hinges. Clara locked the deadbolt. Then she dragged the heavy oak table, the one Arthur had built with his bare hands, and jammed it against the door. Outside, the noise was deafening. The howling was gone, replaced by the frenzied sounds of destruction. They were chewing the window frames. They were digging under the foundations. Crash. The glass of the kitchen window shattered. A wolf's head pushed through, snarling, cutting its snout on the shards but ignoring the pain. Clara grabbed the iron poker from the stove. She swung with all her remaining strength. The iron connected with the wolf's skull with a wet thud. The beast yelped and fell back. But another was already pushing through the gap. She was overrun. The cold rushed in through the broken window, instantly dropping the cabin temperature. The stove was fighting a losing battle. Clara backed into the corner of the room, near the old radio. She held the last magnesium flare in her left hand, the striker cap in her right. "Come on then," she whispered, her voice trembling. The front door groaned. The hinges were giving way. The wood around the lock splintered. With a final, splintering crash, the door flew open. The Kolat stood there. He was magnificent and terrifying. Up close, he was huge, his shoulder height nearly reaching Clara's chest. His eyes were yellow burners, intelligent and cruel. He stepped over the wreckage of the door, filling the small room with his musk. He looked at Clara. He didn't rush. He knew he had won. He lowered his head, baring teeth that were yellowed and chipped from years of cracking bone. Clara looked him in the eye. She didn't look away. "You want my home?" she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She didn't strike the flare. Not yet. She waited. The Kolat lunged. As he sprang, Clara dropped to her knees. It was a move of desperation, her old joints screaming. The wolf sailed over her head, expecting her to be standing. As he passed over her, Clara struck the flare. Psst, ch, t. The magnesium ignited instantly, burning at 2,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than lava. She didn't throw it. She thrust it upward, blindly. Behind her, the flare caught the Kolat in the flank as he landed and turned. The intense heat and blinding white light in the confined space were catastrophic. The wolf's fur ignited instantly. The Kolat shrieked a sound that sounded terrifyingly human. The blinding light disoriented him. He thrashed, knocking over the stovepipe, sending soot and smoke billowing into the room. The fire on his back panicked him. The alpha, the unkillable ghost, was suddenly just a terrified animal. He scrambled backward, slipping on the floorboards, desperate to escape the burning sun that this old woman wielded. He bolted out the broken door, a streak of fire running into the night. Clara crawled to the door, the flare still sputtering in her hand. She threw it out onto the porch. The pack, seeing their alpha retreat in flames, seeing the magic fire that the human controlled, broke. The hive mind shattered. They turned and ran, chasing their burning leader back into the taiga. The silence returned. Clara slumped against the doorframe. The cold was inside now. The cabin was breached. The fire in the stove was dying. She closed her eyes. She had won the battle, but the war against the cold was lost. She was too tired to fix the window, too tired to move the table. "I'm coming, Arthur," she whispered. She drifted. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was rhythmic. It wasn't a wolf. It was deeper. Clara opened her eyes. A bright light was cutting through the broken door. Not fire. An LED searchlight. The sound of rotor blades chopped the frozen air. A man in a thick orange parka jumped from a skid before the helicopter even touched the ground. He sprinted through the snow, vaulting the porch railing. "Mother!" It was David. He found her sitting amidst the wreckage, the iron poker still in her hand, the room freezing. He fell to his knees, ripping off his gloves to check her pulse. "Mother, can you hear me?" Clara blinked. Her lips were blue, her eyelashes frosted shut. "David?" she croaked. "I'm here. I saw the fire." The satellite thermal picked up the heat signature of the shed burning. "We came as fast as we could." He began to wrap her in emergency thermal blankets. Clara grabbed his arm. Her grip was weak, iron hard. "The sheep," she whispered. "Check." "The sheep." David looked at the ruined cabin, then out at the dark pen. "They're there, Mom," he said, his voice breaking with relief. "They're huddled in the corner. Baron is standing guard. They're alive." Clara let out a breath that seemed to carry the last of her tension with it. She allowed David to lift her, her small frame light as a bird in his arms. As he carried her to the waiting helicopter, the sun began to crest over the Verkhoyansk range. It was a pale, weak sun, but it was light. Clara looked back one last time at the little cabin, the smoke still rising from the ruins of the shed, the blood on the snow. It was broken. It was frozen. But it was still standing, and so was she. Clara survived that night with severe frostbite and exhaustion, but she kept all 30 of her sheep. While she eventually moved to the city with David, every winter, the locals say the wolves still give that cabin a wide berth, remembering the night the old woman wielded the sun. If Clara's incredible fight for survival gave you chills, hit that like button and share this video with someone who thinks they're having a tough day. Do you think you could survive a night in the Pole of Cold? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story of true human grit. Stay wild and stay warm.